"Do you remember me now, Mr. Whitmore?" The question did not come out loud at first. It lived in Naomi Carter's chest like a second heartbeat as she rose from counsel table and smoothed the front of her navy suit with steady fingers. The kind of steady that only came after years of teaching your body not to flinch when power looked your way. Across the federal courtroom, under the cold white glow of recessed lights and the polished seal of the United States behind the bench, Edward Whitmore lifted his head with the bored confidence of a man who had spent 40 years buying silence, buying loyalty, buying the soft rearrangement of facts. Then his eyes found her. Something in his expression changed so slightly most people would have missed it. But Naomi saw it. She saw the pause in his blink, the way his jaw set a half-second too late, the way his hand stopped moving over the yellow legal pad in front of him. Recognition had entered the room before anyone spoke its name. The courtroom itself seemed built for restraint. Oak railings, brass fixtures, a flag standing perfectly still in the corner, the faint scent of paper, wool, and stale air conditioning. 12 jurors sat in 2 neat rows, watching with the careful faces of people who knew they were standing near something important even if they didn't yet know where the center of it was. At the defense table, Whitmore's attorneys looked immaculate and expensive, their silver pins aligned beside color-tabbed binders. Behind them, a few reporters leaned forward, hungry in that quiet way reporters often are, like they could smell the moment before it happened. Naomi did not rush. She had learned long ago that powerful men depended on other people rushing. She picked up a single folder, slim and gray, and stepped toward the lectern. Her heels made almost no sound on the courtroom carpet, but the room felt louder with each step she took. When she stopped, she placed the folder down with a softness that somehow carried farther than a slam would have. The judge nodded once. Naomi looked at the witness stand, then at the jury, and only then did she let her eyes settle on Edward Whitmore. 15 years had changed him, but not in the ways men like him feared most. His hair was whiter now, his face more carefully assembled, his tan expensive and slightly too warm against the starkness of the courtroom light. He still wore wealth like armor, still sat as though every chair had been made for him. But she could see age where magazines once saw force. She could see fatigue around the mouth, the faint swelling under the eyes. The burden of a man who had spent too many years believing consequence was something that happened to other people. Naomi opened the folder and drew out one page. Not the most devastating one. Not yet. Just enough paper to let anticipation breathe. She heard someone in the gallery clear his throat. Somewhere near the back, an HVAC vent clicked. Then she spoke, her voice low, even, and devastating precisely because it did not need to be loud. "Mr. Whitmore," she said, "have we met before today?" One of his attorneys shifted immediately, ready to object, but Whitmore lifted 2 fingers without looking away from her. It was a small gesture, practiced, aristocratic, and for one flicker of a second, it transported Naomi backward into another room with another kind of lighting, another kind of audience, another night when he had dismissed her with the same smooth hand and the same belief that the world would always bend around him. He looked at her now as if searching through dust for a face he had once decided not to remember. "I don't believe so," he said. The lie arrived polished, easy, almost elegant. A few jurors wrote something down. Naomi nodded as if she had expected nothing else. "You don't believe so," she repeated, letting the words rest in the air just long enough to lose their shape and become something else. She turned one page over. "That's interesting." His lead counsel stood. "Objection, Your Honor." "Relevance." The judge adjusted her glasses and studied Naomi for a beat. "Counselor." Naomi didn't break rhythm. "It goes to credibility, motive, and witness memory, Your Honor." The judge considered that, then gave a single nod. "I'll allow a limited foundation. Proceed." A faint stir moved through the room. Naomi thanked the court and faced Whitmore again. Outside, somewhere beyond the sealed windows, Manhattan traffic kept moving. Ambulances and black cars and delivery trucks all following routes that had nothing to do with what was happening on the 31st floor of the courthouse. But in that room, time had narrowed. Naomi could feel it, could feel the years standing behind her in silence. The graveyard shifts, the scholarship essays written at a chipped kitchen table, the campus jobs, the hours in law libraries where she stayed until the fluorescent lights buzzed louder than her thoughts. The interviews where men smiled at her resumed before glancing at her skin and deciding, almost imperceptibly, to lower their expectations. All of it had led here, not to revenge, not exactly, but to this clean and public moment in which memory would no longer belong only to the people who could afford to shape it. Whitmore leaned back in his chair, but he had lost the ease he walked in with. Naomi saw it in the way his thumb rubbed once against the side of his pen. She saw it in the stillness of his shoulders, the kind people mistake for calm when it is often calculation. He was trying to place her, and that mattered more than whether he admitted it. Because recognition was a crack, and cracks did not stay small when truth kept pressing at the glass. Naomi rested her fingertips lightly on the edge of the lectern and said, "Then let me help refresh your memory." Edward Whitmore held her gaze a second longer than he should have, and in that extra second Naomi saw the first fracture spread. Not fear, not yet. Men like him did not fear quickly. What came first was irritation, the private offense of being confronted by a face he had once decided did not belong in his world. He adjusted the cuff of his shirt and leaned back as if comfort itself could restore the hierarchy he was used to. "Go ahead," he said, with a little shrug that invited the room to believe this was beneath him. Naomi nodded once. 15 years ago, she said, you attended the Whitmore Foundation Winter Gala at the Hallbrook Hotel on East 57th Street. One of the jurors looked up immediately. Another stopped writing. The defense table stayed very still. Whitmore answered without hesitation. "I attended many events." "I am sure you did," Naomi said. "This one was on December 12th. Snow outside. Black town cars lined up at the curb. Crystal chandeliers in the main ballroom. A string quartet near the south wall. You gave a speech about opportunity." She let the last word settle there, clean and cold. Across from her, Whitmore's expression did not break, but his eyes sharpened. He remembered the room now. Maybe not her yet, but the room, the applause, the expensive glassware, the donors in silk and tuxedos nodding along while he spoke about lifting others with one hand and protecting his image with the other. "Counselor," his attorney said, rising halfway. "Your Honor, this is theater." Judge Hayes did not even look up from her notes when she answered. "Sit down, Mr. Levin. I said limited foundation. I meant it." The attorney lowered himself back into his chair with a tight mouth. Naomi kept her hands relaxed on the lectern. She had learned that tension traveled. If she clenched her jaw, the jury would feel strain. If she stayed calm, they would feel control. That night, she continued, a hotel employee brought her daughter to work because childcare fell through. The girl was told to stay quiet and out of the way. She stood near the service corridor behind the ballroom, close enough to hear your speech and the conversations that followed it. Whitmore's gaze changed then. Not fully, but enough. Naomi saw the old instinct working behind his eyes, sorting faces by class, by usefulness, by whether they deserved remembrance. The courtroom was silent except for the low scratch of a reporter's pen. "Are you suggesting," Whitmore said, "that I was expected to remember every child who wandered through a hotel event 15 years ago?" He smiled when he said it, and the smile was almost worse than the denial. It carried the same polished contempt, the same effortless reduction of a human being into background scenery. Naomi felt the old sting in her chest, but it passed through her now instead of stopping there. "No," she said. "I am suggesting that some moments do not need to be important to the person who causes them in order to shape the person who receives them." The sentence landed harder than she expected. A woman in the jury box blinked and lowered her pen. Even Judge Hayes lifted her eyes. Whitmore's smile faded by a degree so small it might have gone unnoticed by anyone who had not spent years studying people who lied for a living. Naomi picked up a single page from the folder and did not look at it. She already knew every line by heart. "After your speech," she said, several donors gathered near the West Bar. The child asked a question. It was not rude. It was not loud. She asked why a foundation that spoke about helping families was cutting scholarships in neighborhoods that needed them most. Whitmore's fingers tightened around his pen. There it was. Not memory in full, but contact. The first spark against dry paper. Naomi watched his face as the past came back to him not as a story, but as inconvenience. And maybe that was what made it unmistakable. He did not remember her pain. He remembered being challenged. "And you answered her," Naomi said softly. "Do you recall what you said?" He looked at her, then at the jury, then back at her again, measuring. No, he said. Then I do, Naomi replied. The air in the courtroom seemed to thin. You looked at a black girl standing in the doorway and said, "Girls like you do not matter. You never will." No one moved. Even the reporters stopped writing for one suspended second, as if the sentence itself had taken up all available space. Naomi let the silence breathe. She did not rush to fill it. She had waited 15 years for that room to hear what the other room had laughed away. The sentence stayed in the air like cold metal. For a moment, nobody in the courtroom seemed willing to touch it. Edward Whitmore did not deny it right away, and that silence did more damage than any objection his lawyers could have made. Naomi watched his face with the same discipline she had taught herself in law school and sharpened through years of depositions, hearings, and witness interviews. She knew the exact second a memory moved from inconvenience to threat. It happened in the eyes first. His gaze did not soften. It hardened, not with shame, but with calculation. He was no longer searching for whether he remembered. He was deciding what it would cost him if everyone else believed that he did. Mr. Levin rose again, quicker this time. Your Honor, this is improper character evidence. Judge Hayes looked over the rim of her glasses, patient in the way only someone with real authority could afford to be. I will decide what is improper, counsel. The words were not loud, but they settled the room. Mr. Levin sat. One of the reporters near the back resumed, writing so fast the sound was almost like dry leaves brushing concrete. Naomi kept her hands still. She had learned long ago that stillness could command more attention than movement. You deny saying it? She asked. Whitmore leaned forward, folding his hands in front of him with the polished sorrow of a man trying on sincerity. I deny your interpretation of a conversation you claim happened when you were a child. There were small murmurs in the gallery, quickly swallowed. Naomi nodded once, as though she had expected him to reach for distance instead of truth. My interpretation, she repeated. That is interesting, because those were your exact words. He gave a faint smile then, practiced and bloodless. Memory is unreliable, Miss Carter. She let the name sit there. Miss Carter. Clean. Formal. As if saying it properly now could erase the way he had once looked through her. Naomi reached for the gray folder and withdrew a second page, then placed it beside the first with careful precision. Sometimes it is, she said. And sometimes memory is the only thing poor people have left when powerful people are done rewriting the record. A quiet shift went through the jury. Not dramatic, just human. A man in the front row straightened. A woman near the end folded her hands over her notebook and looked directly at Whitmore, not with outrage, but with the sharper thing that often came before it, recognition. Naomi could feel the room changing shape around the truth. Not because everyone suddenly knew everything, but because now they knew enough to suspect what kind of man sat at the defense table. She turned slightly toward the bench. Your Honor, with the court's permission, I would like to establish why this memory remained precise. Judge Hayes nodded. Proceed. Naomi looked back at Whitmore, but her voice reached farther than him now. It reached the jury box, the reporters, the clerks, the strangers in the gallery, and maybe even the younger version of herself who had once stood under hotel light, trying to understand how a person could look directly at a child and decide she was less than human. I remembered the date, Naomi said, because it was my mother's birthday. That landed differently, softer, and somehow harder. She was working a double shift that night at the Hallbrook Hotel. Because our rent had gone up $70 that month, and she said we would celebrate on Sunday instead. I wore the only dress I had that still fit, navy blue with a missing button on the sleeve. My mother fixed my hair in the employee restroom under a flickering mirror using hand lotion because she had forgotten to bring anything else. We stood by the service door because we knew that ballroom was not made for people like us. And still, when you spoke about opportunity, I listened. Whitmore's expression shifted again, the edges of his confidence drawing inward. Naomi saw it now. He remembered the question. He remembered the little interruption in a room built to flatter him. Maybe he even remembered the laughter that followed. But what unsettled him was not the past itself. It was the fact that the child in the doorway had come back as the woman at the lectern. You spoke about investing in the future, Naomi continued, her voice calm and almost unbearably even. I believed you enough to ask why those investments seemed to stop where neighborhoods like mine began. She looked down at the page in front of her, though she did not need to. And you answered in front of donors, board members, and hotel staff. Whitmore shifted in his chair. Just an inch. But an inch was a confession when a man had walked in expecting to own the room. You did not call security, Naomi said. You did not ask who I was. You did not say I was too young to understand. You looked at me and decided that my life could be summarized in a single sentence. She paused then, not for effect, but because some truths deserved the dignity of air around them. I have spent 15 years proving that sentence false. Today is simply the first time you have had to hear it out loud. The room did not exhale after Naomi finished. It only grew more exact. The scrape of a chair leg somewhere in the gallery sounded too sharp. The fluorescent lights above the bench cast that same pale, unforgiving glow across every face, flattening status, flattening charm, flattening the small tricks people used to seem larger than they were. Edward Whitmore sat in it like a man realizing light could be a kind of witness. His attorney leaned toward him, whispering from the corner of his mouth, but Whitmore lifted one hand without looking away from Naomi. He wanted control back, and men like him often believed control could be restored by speaking as though nothing had touched them. Your Honor, he said, before his counsel could object again, I built companies that employ thousands of people. I have funded scholarships, hospitals, and housing projects across this city. If opposing counsel wants to turn this trial into a personal grievance over something she believes she heard as a child, that says more about her than it does about me. He spoke with perfect volume, polished diction, and the careful gravity of a man who had been applauded for most of his adult life. For a heartbeat, the words almost did what they were designed to do. They widened the frame. They tried to make Naomi small again. Not wrong. Small. Naomi had expected that. Powerful people rarely defended themselves by denying harm first. They defended themselves by listing accomplishments, as if generosity elsewhere canceled cruelty where it had been convenient. She let the silence sit a moment after he finished, then stepped away from the lectern and toward the evidence monitor with the same calm she had carried since the beginning of the hearing. No one is disputing your public image today, Mr. Whitmore, she said. We are discussing your private conduct and your credibility under oath. She pressed a button on the console. The screen lit up, throwing a soft rectangle of light across the front of the courtroom. A scanned gala program appeared, elegant cream paper with gold lettering, the Whitmore Foundation crest embossed at the top, the date clear and centered, December 12th. Naomi did not look at the screen. She knew the image mattered less than what it unlocked. You testified this morning that the Hallbrook Gala was an ordinary donor event, she said. Do you remember that? Yes. And you testified that no scholarship decisions were discussed there. That is correct. Naomi lifted another page from the folder. Then help me understand why your own foundation program lists a closed board session that same evening regarding the East Harlem Scholarship Restructuring Initiative. This time the objection came fast. Objection. Mischaracterizes the exhibit. Judge Hayes held out her hand. Bring it up. Naomi approached the bench, handed over the document, and returned to her place. The judge scanned it, then looked up at Whitmore with a face that revealed nothing except attention. Overruled, she said. He may answer. Whitmore's jaw shifted once. Board sessions cover many things. That does not mean I discussed them with a child. Naomi nodded. That is true. It does not. But it places you in the exact room, on the exact night, discussing the exact issue that prompted my question. A low current moved through the gallery. Not noise, exactly. More like the soft turning of minds as separate facts began locking together. Naomi felt it. More importantly, Whitmore felt it. He adjusted the knot of his tie for the first time all morning. It was a tiny gesture, almost elegant, but she remembered another room where he had adjusted his cufflinks after speaking to her, as if she were something disposable. Memory had a way of returning with details that did not care whether you wanted them. Mr. Whitmore, Naomi said, did your foundation cut scholarship commitments in predominantly black neighborhoods that winter? The foundation made strategic changes based on long-term impact. That is not what I asked. Then ask a better question. His voice sharpened, and the sharpness did what evidence sometimes could not. It revealed appetite, not for truth, for dominance. A few jurors glanced up at once. Naomi did not react. She simply let the edge in his tone ring out and fade on its own. All right, she said softly. Were those cuts concentrated in neighborhoods your internal memos described as low-yield communities? Mr. Levin stood again, but too late. Whitmore had already answered on instinct. That language was never meant in the way you are implying. Naomi turned her head slightly, like someone hearing a lock click open. So the language existed. Whitmore froze. Not dramatically. Just enough. A breath held a fraction too long. A blink that came after the damage instead of before it. His attorney closed his eyes for half a second. Naomi let the moment stand on its own feet. This was how empires weakened in public. Not with shouting. With precision. With one answer pulling loose another until the whole polished structure began to show the strain beneath it. She took a step closer to the lectern and lowered her voice, forcing the room to follow her into the quiet. When I asked you why students in neighborhoods like mine were losing opportunities while you praised yourself for creating them, you did not answer with policy. You answered with contempt. That is why this matters. Because the same instinct that dismissed a child in a doorway is the instinct this court is now being asked to measure in contracts, ledgers, and sworn testimony. The judge said nothing. The jury said nothing. Even the reporters had stopped chasing every line and started listening instead. Across the room, Edward Whitmore sat in his tailored suit beneath the flat courtroom light, and for the first time he no longer looked like a man managing a narrative. He looked like a man being returned to one. Naomi did not move right away. She let Edward Whitmore sit inside what he had just given the court, because men like him had spent their entire lives mistaking interruption for strength. Across the courtroom, the jurors were no longer looking at him as a distant executive wrapped in abstract accusations and expensive counsel. They were looking at him the way ordinary people look at someone whose mask has shifted half an inch and revealed the face underneath. Judge Hayes made a note in the margin of her file. The scratching of her pen sounded measured, almost gentle, but in that room it carried the weight of a door closing. Naomi turned one page in her folder and glanced down, not because she needed direction, but because ritual mattered. In court, ritual steadied truth. It gave shape to memory and kept emotion from spilling where it could be dismissed as weakness. She lifted her eyes again. Let us stay with your language for a moment, Mr. Whitmore. He sat straighter. The reflex was immediate. A wealthy man being asked about documents could recover from that. A wealthy man being asked about language knew he was entering dangerous ground, because language had fingerprints. You testified that the phrase low-yield communities was not meant the way I am implying, Naomi said. Then tell the court how it was meant. He gave a thin smile that did not reach his eyes. In philanthropic strategy, those terms refer to long-term measurable outcomes. Measured by whom? Naomi asked. By analysts, boards, consultants. People with expertise. People with power, Naomi said softly. Mr. Levin stood again. Objection. Argumentative. Overruled, Judge Hayes said, without hesitation. The answer had come faster this time. That was not lost on anyone. Naomi walked 2 slow steps toward the evidence monitor and called up another exhibit. An internal foundation memorandum appeared on the screen, black text against a white page, cold and bureaucratic in the way harmful things often looked when they were first written down. The relevant line had already been highlighted. Neighborhood investment reduction recommended in low-yield districts with limited donor visibility. No one gasped. Real courtrooms were not built for gasps. But the silence changed. It turned from attention into absorption. Naomi faced the jury only briefly, just long enough to let them read the line for themselves. Then she turned back to Whitmore. Do you see your initials at the bottom of this memorandum? He looked at the screen. For the first time that day, he did not answer immediately. I see initials, he said. I am asking whether they are yours. They appear to be. Appear to be, Naomi repeated, and this time even one of the jurors let out a breath that sounded almost like disbelief. Whitmore heard it too. His expression tightened. These are old administrative records, he said. You are trying to force moral meaning onto technical language. Naomi rested one hand lightly against the edge of the lectern. No, Mr. Whitmore. I am asking whether your technical language had moral consequences. The words landed with no rise in volume, no heat, nothing he could object to except their accuracy. She stepped closer to the witness stand. Because this is what I want the court to understand. When I was 12 years old, I did not know terms like donor visibility or restructuring initiative or measurable outcomes. I knew what my mother knew. Rent due on the 1st. Groceries running low by Thursday. A winter coat that had to last another year. I knew that school was the one place adults kept telling children like me to believe in. And that night, While you stood in a ballroom lit like a promise, your foundation was discussing which neighborhoods were worth less to you because fewer wealthy people were watching. Whitmore shifted in his chair again. It was slight, but not slight enough. Naomi saw color rise at the base of his neck. Not shame. One. She let that sit for half a beat. The language in these documents is the polished version of what you said to me in person. In private, you called a child irrelevant. On paper, you called her neighborhood low yield. Different vocabulary. Same belief. The courtroom went so still that the faint hum from the ceiling vent seemed louder than it had all morning. Naomi could feel the shift now with full certainty. The jury was not simply hearing evidence. They were beginning to understand the moral architecture of the case, how contracts and comments and selective memory all belong to the same structure. She opened the folder once more and removed a photograph in a clear sleeve. She did not display it yet. She only held it at her side, feeling its small weight against her fingers. Her mother had kept it all those years in a shoebox with birthday cards, church programs, and old utility bills. Naomi looked at Whitmore, really looked at him, and saw that he was trying to guess what came next. Men like him always believed the danger was in the next document, the next witness, the next line item. They rarely understood that sometimes the most devastating evidence was not what proved they broke rules. It was what proved they knew exactly who they were while doing it. I want to show you something from that night, Naomi said, her voice quiet enough that everyone leaned in to catch it. And I want you to look at it carefully before you answer your next question. Naomi lifted the photograph from its sleeve and handed it to the clerk, who passed it to the witness stand with the careful neutrality courtrooms were built to preserve. Edward Whitmore took it between two fingers as if it might be insignificant. That was his habit. He handled other people's evidence the way he had handled other people's lives, assuming anything outside his control would eventually reduce itself to a minor inconvenience. But when he looked down, something in his face gave way before he could stop it. The photograph was small, glossy, the kind printed at a drugstore from an old disposable camera. It had been taken near the service corridor outside the Hallbrook Ballroom. The image was not elegant. The light was too bright in one corner and too dim in another. A catering cart cut across the frame. One hotel employee in the background had been caught mid-step, blurred at the edge. But in the center stood a 12-year-old black girl in a navy dress with one sleeve cuff turned inward to hide a missing button. Beside her stood a woman in a pressed hotel uniform, smiling with the tired pride of a mother who knew she had to look stronger than she felt. Naomi's hair was pulled back. Her chin was lifted a little too high, the way children do when they are trying to look like disappointment has not found them yet. On the back, written in blue ink, were 4 words in careful block letters. Mama's birthday. Do you recognize the event now? Naomi asked. The room had gone so quiet that even the turning of the photograph in Whitmore's hand sounded louder than it should have. He did not answer immediately. His eyes moved over the picture, not warmly, not nostalgically, but with the strained focus of a man watching the past become harder to dismiss. I recognize a hotel corridor, he said at last. That is all. Naomi nodded once, the way she did when a witness chose the narrower road and forgot that narrow roads often led exactly where she wanted them to go. Do you see yourself in the background reflection? She asked. Mr. Levin started to rise, then sat back down when Whitmore had already looked. The photograph had captured more than the child and her mother. Along the polished brass panel of the catering cart, in a warped strip of reflection, there was the outline of a tuxedoed man turned slightly sideways, one hand raised as if addressing someone just below his eye line. The face was not perfectly clear, but the posture was unmistakable to anyone who had watched Edward Whitmore testify all morning. The same angle of the shoulders, the same lifted hand, the same habit of speaking downward. Whitmore's mouth tightened. That could be anyone. Naomi turned to the evidence monitor, and the image appeared enlarged on the screen. Grainy, imperfect, yet somehow more damning for exactly that reason. It did not look staged. It looked ordinary, which was often where truth survived longest. The board session listed in your gala program, and the hotel employee in the photograph was my mother, Lorraine Carter. She let her mother's name remain in the room a moment. Lorraine Carter. Not employee, not staff, not background. A name, a life. She passed away 6 years ago. Naomi continued, her voice steady. But she kept this photograph in a shoebox under her bed with every bill she paid late and every school certificate she saved on time. She kept it because she believed that one day I would need proof that we were there, even if men like you spent their lives pretending people like us were invisible. A juror in the second row lowered her eyes for a second, then looked back up with a different expression than before. Less curiosity now, more care. Whitmore set the photograph down as if it had become heavier than paper should be. This is sentimental, he said. Not probative. My next question is simple, she said. When your schedule was delayed that night because of an incident near the service corridor, was that incident me? Edward Whitmore looked at the highlighted notation for so long that the courtroom seemed to lean toward him. Naomi did not repeat the question. She had learned that repetition often gave powerful people room to recover, room to turn hesitation into strategy. So she waited. The paper in her hand did not shake. The overhead lights cast a pale band across the witness stand, flattening the planes of Whitmore's face until he looked less like the legend the financial magazines had built and more like what he was in that moment, an aging man trying to decide which version of the truth would cost him the least. I do not recall the specifics of every scheduling delay from 15 years ago, he said at last. Child in a hallway, he said. That does not establish anything about the claims in this case. Naomi let him have the sentence. Sometimes witnesses gave you exactly what you needed by trying to escape what you had already built. Actually, she said, it helps establish something essential. Pattern. She moved back to the lectern and laid the incident log beside the foundation memorandum and the gala seating record, 3 documents from different sources, 3 separate records that had never been designed to meet. Yet here they were, touching edges. You have asked this court to believe that your language was technical, that your decisions were strategic, that your memory is selective only because time has passed. But the records show the same thing again and again. A child raises a question from outside your circle. You call her an incident. A neighborhood asks for opportunity. You call it low yield. A fund meant for families is redirected through shell entities. You call it restructuring. Different decade. Different paperwork. Same instinct. Whitmore's expression hardened. That night. I can believe that. Men in your position are rarely trained to remember the people they remove. But the record remembers. Your own conduct remembers. At the screen, then toward Mr. Levin, then back again. It was a small triangle of movement, but it told the story before his answer did. I receive many internal updates, he said. That is not an answer, Naomi replied. Judge Hayes said nothing, and the silence worked in Naomi's favor. Whitmore drew in a breath. It appears to be from my company. Sent to you directly at 8:14 in the morning, Naomi said, reading from the metadata line. Subject line. Reputational containment options regarding Carter complaint. Mr. Levin rose immediately. Your Honor, privilege. Naomi was ready for that. The court has already ruled on the crime fraud exception as to this document set. Judge Hayes did not hesitate. Overruled. Mr. Levin sat, but slower this time, as if even he could feel the floor shifting under the defense. Naomi pressed the key that enlarged the highlighted section. The words filled the monitor in stark black type. Recommend aggressive challenge to counsel background and credibility before merits phase. Secondary option, private pressure through firm channels to facilitate reassignment. Naomi did not read the lines with anger. She read them the way one reads numbers on a bill that has finally come due. Do you see the phrase private pressure through firm channels? She asked. Whitmore's face stayed composed, but the composure had become work now. It sat on him instead of living in him. I see it. Did you authorize that strategy? I authorized many strategic reviews. I do not recall every phrase used by staff. Naomi nodded. Then perhaps this will help. She lifted another page and held it just long enough for the jury to see that it was an email printout with his name on the reply line. Then she placed it on the document camera. The screen changed. From Edward Whitmore. 2 lines only. Do it quietly. I do not want her in the room. A sound moved through the gallery, so soft it might not have counted as a sound at all, more like breath catching at the same time in several different throats. Naomi let the email remain visible. She did not need to decorate it. The power of certain sentences was that they arrived already wearing their meaning. Judge Hayes lifted her eyes from the screen and fixed them on Whitmore. Even the jurors who had been careful all morning now looked openly. Stunned, Naomi felt the old service corridor come back to her then, not as pain, but as pattern made visible. Kept away from donor areas. I do not want her in the room. 15 years between the two sentences. 15 years of money, lawyers, boardrooms, charity dinners, and editorial praise. And still, when confronted by the same black girl grown into a woman, his instinct had not changed. Remove her. Isolate her. Make the room smaller until she disappears. You told the hotel staff to keep me away when I was 12, Naomi said quietly. And when this case was filed, you tried to remove me again through my law firm. Same instinct. Same language. Same belief that proximity to power belongs to you and not to people like me. Whitmore straightened. That is your interpretation. No, Naomi said. That is your pattern. The words settled into the courtroom with an almost physical weight. Naomi could feel something important happening now, not explosive, not cinematic in the way television imagined trials to be, but real. The jury was no longer receiving facts one at a time. They were seeing the shape beneath them. This case was not merely about missing funds or altered records, though those mattered. It was about a man whose public generosity had always depended on private exclusion, a man who believed he could decide who counted, who belonged, and who got erased before the real conversation began. Naomi stepped closer to the witness stand and lowered her voice, forcing Whitmore to listen instead of perform. When you saw my name on the complaint, you knew exactly who I was, did not you? For the first time that day, he looked at her without the shelter of polish. The answer did not come quickly because the truth was no longer trapped in memory. It was staring back at him from his own words. Naomi held his gaze and waited, steady as courthouse stone, while the entire room understood that whatever he said next would not only answer her question. It would reveal whether he was still trying to outrun the child he had once told did not matter. Edward Whitmore did not answer right away, and that was answer enough for anyone paying attention. Naomi watched the pause settle over him like dust on polished glass. All morning he had moved through questions with the confidence of a man who believed every hard edge in his life could be sanded down by counsel, by money, by time. But now the room had narrowed around a simpler thing. Not whether he could explain a fund transfer. Not whether he could soften a memorandum. Whether he had recognized the black girl he once tried to remove and then tried to remove again when she returned with a law degree and a complaint bearing his name. His fingers rested on the table beside the yellow legal pad, but they were no longer still. One tap, then another. Tiny sounds. Easy to miss unless you knew that people often told the truth first with their hands. I see many names, he said finally. I do not attach personal history to every case that crosses my desk. Naomi let the sentence breathe for a beat. Every case, she repeated. That is interesting, because this one received your personal reply within 11 minutes. She lifted a thin stack of printed emails and set them on the document camera one by one, each page falling into view on the screen with the quiet finality of cards being turned over. The chain showed the complaint routed from general counsel to executive leadership, then directly to Whitmore. Subject lines. Timestamps. Forwarded annotations. The final page carried his response again in those same clipped words. Do it quietly. I do not want her in the room. Naomi did not embellish it. She did not need to. In a courtroom, repetition was only powerful when it arrived with new context, and now it had one. You replied in 11 minutes, she said. Faster than your own legal team. Faster than your communications office. Faster than the board liaison copied on the thread. So let me ask again. When you saw my name, did you know exactly who I was? Whitmore looked at the screen, then at her, and for the first time all morning his face seemed to age under the light. Not because time had suddenly found him, but because effort had. Holding the lie was beginning to cost more than telling part of the truth. Mr. Levin leaned toward him and whispered something urgent. Whitmore did not respond. He kept his eyes on Naomi, and she saw it then, clear as winter glass. He remembered. Not the texture of her dress or the exact shape of the service hallway. Men like him rarely stored details about people they considered beneath notice. But he remembered the disruption, the audacity, the child who had asked a question in a room built to flatter him. I remembered the incident, he said at last. The word landed wrong the moment it left his mouth. He seemed to hear it too. Several jurors looked up at once. Naomi did not rescue him from it. The incident, she repeated softly. That is still how you think of it. He shifted in his chair. I remembered a child creating a disturbance at a formal event. Naomi tilted her head a fraction, almost sad, because sometimes the most revealing thing a witness could do was tell the truth without realizing how much of himself had come with it. A disturbance, she said. Not a question. A challenge. Whitmore snapped, before he could stop himself. The courtroom went still in a sharper way than before. There it was. Not just recognition. Resentment preserved in amber. Naomi felt the line tighten all the way through the years, from the service corridor to the email thread to the witness stand. He had not remembered her because she mattered to him as a child. He had remembered her because he had never forgiven being questioned by someone he thought should have remained invisible. So you did remember me, Naomi said. Whitmore opened his mouth, then closed it. Mr. Levin stood. Your Honor, counsel is badgering the witness. Judge Hayes looked at Whitmore, not Naomi. He may answer. The room waited. Even the air seemed to wait. Outside the courthouse, the city kept moving through sirens and lunch deliveries and office towers throwing afternoon light onto the avenue. But inside that courtroom, everything had contracted to one man's inability to escape what he had already admitted. I remembered the moment, he said, each word clipped tight. Not you personally. Naomi nodded once, but her eyes did not leave his. And yet when the complaint arrived, your first instinct was not to review the merits. It was to get me reassigned. She touched the email printout with one fingertip. Not opposing counsel. Not Carter complaint as a legal matter. Me. Whitmore said nothing. Naomi stepped away from the lectern and let the distance between them do its own work. That is the part one want the jury to understand, she said, and now she was speaking to the whole room, not just the witness. This case did not become personal because I made it personal. It became personal because the moment my name entered his field of vision, he reached for the same solution he had reached for when I was 12 years old. Remove her. Keep her away. Make sure the room returns to the people he thinks belong in it. One of the jurors, an older man with silver at his temples, set down his pen entirely. He was no longer taking notes. He was listening with the full stillness of someone who had begun to see the moral shape of the evidence. Naomi picked up another document from her folder, this one thinner, almost ordinary looking. After Mr. Whitmore sent that email, she said, someone contacted a senior partner at my firm with concerns about my professionalism, my objectivity, and my temperament. She placed the call log on the screen. Date, time, source number, duration, then the partner memorandum summarizing the conversation. The phrasing was careful, but familiar in its design. Suggested she may be too emotionally invested to handle matter effectively. Recommended substitution for the good of the client relationship. Naomi looked at Whitmore again. Do you know what my firm did with that call? She asked. He did not answer. They documented it. Then they put me in charge. The first thing close to human heat touched the room. Not laughter exactly, but the release that comes when dignity refuses to bend. Naomi let it pass, and then drew the thread tight again. So now we are clear. You remembered enough to try to move me. You failed. And that failure is the reason we are no longer discussing a memory only I carried. We are discussing a pattern you continued. She gathered the email pages into one neat stack, her movements controlled, almost gentle. My next witness, she said, will explain what happened inside Whitmore Capital after your first attempt to push me out did not work. The shift after Naomi's last sentence was almost invisible, but everyone felt it. Until that point, Edward Whitmore had still been trying to contain the morning inside the boundaries of memory, language, and motive. Now the case was moving somewhere harder for him to charm and harder for his attorneys to blur. Inside the machinery of his own company, Naomi gathered the exhibits at the lectern with the calm economy that had become its own kind of authority and turned toward the bench. Plaintiff calls Helen Price, she said. The side door opened, and a woman in her early 60s stepped into the courtroom wearing a charcoal jacket buttoned too carefully at the waist, as if neatness itself could keep her steady. Helen moved with the posture of someone who had spent decades trying not to take up more space than necessary. Her silver hair was pinned back. Her hands were empty except for a pair of reading glasses she held folded in one palm. Naomi watched Whitmore as Helen crossed to the witness stand. That was where the real change showed. Not in outrage. Not in surprise. In recognition, mixed with something colder. Appraisal. A man scanning the cost of a person who had decided, finally, to stop protecting him. Helen was sworn in. Her voice trembled only once on her name, then settled. Naomi approached slowly. No theatrics, no sharpened edge. She had met Helen 3 months earlier in a diner in Queens, where the coffee had tasted burnt and the vinyl booth had squeaked every time either of them shifted. Helen had arrived with a manila envelope clutched tight to her chest, and the face of someone who had spent years rehearsing silence so thoroughly that truth felt almost impolite. Naomi had not pushed her that day, had not opened with subpoenas or timelines or legal pressure. She had only asked whether Helen wanted water, whether the heat in the diner was too high, whether she was all right to take her time. Kindness was sometimes the only doorway shame would walk through. Now Helen sat beneath courtroom light, looking smaller than she had in the diner and stronger at the same time. "Ms. Price," Naomi said, "what was your position at Whitmore Capital?" "Executive Administrative Director," Helen answered. "I worked directly under senior leadership for 14 years. Did that include Mr. Whitmore?" Helen glanced toward the defense table, then back to Naomi. "Yes." "Were you employed there when this lawsuit was first filed?" "I was." Naomi nodded and took one step closer. "Did you see internal communications concerning me after the complaint was served?" Helen swallowed. The room had gone quiet in a new way now, less like attention and more like approach. As if everyone sensed they were about to hear from the part of the building where windows did not open. "Yes," she said. "I saw emails, meeting requests, and handwritten routing notes." "Why did you see them?" Naomi asked. "Because they passed through my office." Naomi let the answer settle. Simple, clean, believable. Juries trusted people who spoke like that, people who sounded as though they were still a little surprised to be in the story at all. Did there come a point when you became concerned by what you were seeing? Helen looked down at her folded glasses. "Yes." "Why?" Helen's fingers tightened around the frame. "Because it was not about defending the company on the facts." Her voice did not rise. It only sharpened with honesty. It was about finding ways to discredit you before the case could move forward. Mr. Levin stood so quickly his chair rolled back an inch. "Objection. Conclusion. Basis?" Judge Hayes asked. Helen lifted her eyes before Naomi could answer for her. "Because I typed some of the directives myself." That changed the room. Not dramatically. Real courtrooms were rarely dramatic in the way movies hoped. But the effect was immediate. Mr. Levin sat more slowly this time. Whitmore did not move at all, which was its own form of movement now. Naomi felt something steady inside her. Not triumph, not revenge, just the hard stillness that came when truth stopped needing her to carry it alone. "What kind of directives?" Naomi asked. Helen took a breath. "Requests to review your college records, your speaking engagements, social media posts, old neighborhood contacts, anything that might suggest bias or instability. There were also calls made to your firm." Naomi kept her face neutral. She already knew this. But the jury needed to hear it from Helen, in Helen's voice, with Helen's cost visible on every syllable. Was this presented as routine litigation preparation? Naomi asked. "At first," Helen said. "Then it changed." "How?" Helen looked directly at her now. "Because after someone realized who you were, the language became personal." A faint current moved through the gallery. Naomi did not turn to look. She kept her eyes on Helen. "What do you mean by personal?" Helen unfolded the reading glasses in her hand and then folded them again, buying herself 1 second of courage. "I mean there was a meeting in the smaller executive conference room on the 32nd floor. Frosted glass walls. Long walnut table. Mr. Whitmore at the head. 2 attorneys from outside counsel. Me taking notes. I remember the room smelled like lemon polish and printer heat because the quarterly board books had just come off the copier." She stopped there, and the detail did more than polish ever could. It made the memory real. "At one point," Helen said, "Mr. Whitmore asked if there was a way to make sure you never reached discovery." No one moved. Naomi could hear the faint hum of the lights above the witness box, and, somewhere behind her, the soft scratch of a juror's pen returning to paper. Helen looked toward Whitmore only once, and when she did it was not with anger. It was with the exhaustion of someone who had spent too many years watching powerful men call strategy what ordinary people would have called cruelty. "And then," she said, quieter now, "he said he had dealt with this girl before." For the first time that day, Edward Whitmore's control did not merely thin. It cracked. Not in some dramatic outburst, not with raised voices or a slammed hand or anything careless enough to look honest. It cracked in a smaller, truer way. His eyes moved to Helen Price with a flash of something raw before the expression disappeared under training, money, and habit. But it was there, and the jury saw it. Naomi saw it too. So did Judge Hayes, who leaned forward just slightly, the way people do when testimony stops sounding prepared and starts sounding expensive. Helen kept her hands wrapped around her reading glasses as if they were the last ordinary thing left in the room. Naomi did not interrupt the silence that followed. She let Helen's final sentence settle where it needed to settle. I have dealt with this girl before. It landed differently than the records had landed. Documents could be explained away. Emails could be framed as strategy. But a spoken sentence carried posture inside it. It told the room how a man thought when he believed only insiders were listening. Naomi stepped closer to the witness stand, her tone calm, almost gentle. Miss Price, when Mr. Whitmore said that, what did you understand him to mean? Helen swallowed. That he recognized your name. Recognized it from where? Helen looked once toward the defense table, then back at Naomi. From years earlier. From some incident involving a hotel event. He did not give details then, but he spoke as if you were already known to him. Mr. Levin was on his feet before the sentence fully ended. Objection. Speculation. Sustained as to her interpretation of his internal thoughts, Judge Hayes said. The jury will disregard that portion. Counsel, rephrase. Naomi nodded without resistance. You did not fight a useful ruling. You walked around it. What exactly did Mr. Whitmore say in that meeting, to the best of your recollection? Helen took a breath and answered with the care of someone laying glass on stone. He said, I have dealt with this girl before. She should have stayed outside the room the first time. No one moved. No one even wrote for a second. The sentence hung there under fluorescent light, hard and unmistakable. Naomi felt the old service corridor open in her mind again, the bright brass of the catering cart, the smell of bleach and coffee and hotel heat, her mother's hand warm against the back of her shoulder. She had spent years making sure that memory did not own her. Now it no longer belonged only to her. Whitmore's attorney objected again, but his voice had lost its polish. Your Honor, we challenge the reliability of this alleged statement. Judge Hayes looked at him with visible impatience. You may cross-examine on reliability, counsel. Sit down. He sat. Slowly. Naomi kept her attention on Helen. Did anyone else in the room respond when Mr. Whitmore said that? Yes, Helen said. Outside counsel asked whether there was a documentation trail. Naomi let the answer sink in. And what did Mr. Whitmore say? Helen's fingers tightened around the glasses again. He said, only if somebody kept records nobody should have kept. A faint rustle moved through the jury box. Naomi did not look at them. She did not need to. She could feel the case taking shape now in the only way that mattered. Not as a stack of separate harms, but as a consistent private worldview. A man who believed rooms could be curated. Questions filtered. People redirected. Records erased or discredited if they came from the wrong hands. Did the meeting end there? Naomi asked. No, Helen said. There was discussion about how to delay responses, how to push for reassignment, how to make the case cost your side more time and money. Was there any discussion of reviewing the underlying allegations on their merits before taking those steps? Helen's answer came quickly. Not at first. That answer mattered. It mattered because it stripped away the defense's favorite refuge, the claim that everything had been normal litigation behavior. Normal litigation began with facts. This had begun with removal. Naomi picked up a yellow legal pad from counsel table and walked it to the witness stand. Miss Price, do you recognize this? Helen looked down and nodded almost immediately. Yes. What is it? My meeting notes. From the 32nd floor conference room? Yes. Naomi turned to the bench. Your Honor, previously marked Plaintiff's Exhibit 42. Mr. Levin objected on foundation and hearsay. Naomi was ready for both. She laid the basis cleanly, through Helen's handwriting, date notation, circulation stamp, and the matching calendar invite already entered into evidence. Judge Hayes admitted the exhibit. Naomi placed the page on the document camera, and Helen's handwriting appeared on the screen in blue ink, small and efficient. The script of someone trained to capture power without disturbing it. 3 bullet points were visible under Whitmore's initials. Delay discovery. Pressure firm. Keep Carter outside room. Nobody in the courtroom breathed the same way after that. The words were too plain to hide. Too short to spin. Too close to the hotel notation from 15 years earlier to be coincidence. Naomi turned back toward Whitmore, and now she allowed herself one measured beat of silence before speaking. Mr. Whitmore asked earlier whether this trial was becoming a personal grievance, she said, her voice low and even. It is not. It is a public record of a private pattern. And now that pattern is written in your own language, in your own company, in your own time. Helen looked down, exhausted but steadier than when she had entered. Naomi understood that steadiness. Truth did not always make people feel strong at first. Sometimes it only made them stop hiding. She gathered the admitted exhibit and set it carefully atop the others, building the stack one piece at a time like the years had built her. Then she turned back to Helen for one final question, because there was one more door to open before the whole courtroom understood just how far Whitmore's empire had gone to protect itself. Ms. Price, Naomi said, after that meeting, were any records removed, altered, or routed away from standard retention channels? Helen did not answer at once, and that pause mattered because it was not the pause of someone inventing. It was the pause of someone deciding whether to speak a truth that would not let her return to her old life afterward. Naomi stood still and gave her the room to reach it. The witness stand light cast a pale reflection across Helen's glasses, and for a second she looked less like a former executive administrator and more like what she had probably always been underneath the title. A woman who had spent too many years organizing other people's power and now had to explain what it cost to keep it tidy. Yes, Helen said finally. Her voice was quiet, but it did not shake. Records were moved. Mr. Levin rose so fast his chair legs scraped against the floor. Objection. Judge Hayes looked at him with no visible patience left. On what basis? He faltered for half a beat. Foundation. Naomi did not even turn around. I will lay it. Do that, Judge Hayes said. Mr. Levin sat. Naomi stepped closer to the witness stand. Miss Price, how do you know records were moved? Helen unfolded her glasses, then folded them again. Because I was instructed to change routing labels on document packets and to mark 2 categories of internal files for off-system retention review. What does off-system retention review mean inside Whitmore Capital? Naomi asked. It means records are separated from the normal digital archive before legal hold indexing is completed. That sentence changed the air. Some facts arrived loudly. Others arrived with the chill of a door opening in winter. This was the second kind. The jury did not need a law degree to hear what it meant. Files pulled aside before they could be preserved. Naomi kept her voice even. Who gave that instruction? Helen's eyes flicked toward Whitmore, then back. The directive came through executive channels. That is not my question. Helen swallowed. It came from Mr. Whitmore's office. Naomi let the answer settle where everyone could feel it. Then she lifted a thin binder from counsel table and removed a page marked with colored tabs. Did you make any notation of that instruction at the time? Yes. Naomi placed the page under the document camera. Helen's handwriting appeared. On the screen again, blue ink on cream paper, narrow and careful. Beside a date 2 days after the internal strategy meeting were 7 words underlined twice. Hold selected files outside standard chain. Is that your handwriting? Naomi asked. Yes. And what was the reason given? Helen looked down at the page as though she had hoped the ink might fade over time and had been disappointed to find it still there. The phrase used was unnecessary exposure. Naomi did not rush. She had learned that when dangerous language entered the room, the wisest thing to do was let it stand on its own feet. Unnecessary exposure, she repeated. Exposure to what? Helen drew a slow breath. To discovery requests. To outside review. To anything that might create a broader paper trail. Whitmore shifted in his chair, and this time the movement was impossible to mistake for composure. It was discomfort, plain and human and expensive. Naomi turned one more page and displayed a retention audit log from Whitmore Capital's records system. Several file groups showed the same unusual code entered within 48 hours of the complaint. Manual hold. Executive review. Archive deferred. Ms. Price, Naomi said, did these codes appear during ordinary litigation practice? Not like that, Helen answered. Not across that many categories at once. Which categories were affected? Helen's fingers tightened around the glasses again. Foundation scholarship files. Donor correspondence. Internal memoranda tied to community allocations. and 2 folders from executive communications. Naomi felt the structure beneath the case rise another inch into view. Not an isolated decision. A system. A coordinated narrowing of what truth would be allowed to remain easy to find. Were any names discussed in connection with those executive communication folders? Naomi asked. Helen hesitated only once. Yes. Whose? Yours. The word landed softly, but the room took it hard. Naomi did not look at the jury. She did not need to. She could feel their attention sharpened like wire. What was said about those folders? Helen answered more quickly now, as if having crossed one line made the next one less impossible. That they contained references to prior contact and should not circulate unless reviewed at the top. Naomi stood very still. Prior contact. He had not just remembered her. He had preserved the memory where it served him and hidden it where it could expose him. That was the cruelty of men like Edward Whitmore. They did not forget the people they harmed. They remembered them selectively, according to utility. Did you personally remove any documents from standard circulation? Naomi asked. Helen closed her eyes for 1 second, then opened them. Yes. The answer was barely above a whisper. Why? Naomi asked. Helen looked at her then, and there was something painful and clean in her face, the look of someone finally refusing the shelter of excuses. Because I was afraid, she said. I had worked there a long time. I knew what happened to people who pushed back. I told myself I was moving paperwork, not hurting anyone. That is what offices teach you to believe when harm is dressed like procedure. Nobody moved. Nobody wrote. Even the fluorescent hum seemed farther away now. Naomi understood that sentence at a depth the room might never fully know. Harm dressed like procedure. A child turned into an incident. A neighborhood turned into low yield. A lawyer turned into a problem to be reassigned. Files turned into unnecessary exposure. It was all the same instinct in different clothes. She walked back to the lectern and rested both hands on the wood, grounding herself in its cool finish. Did those records remain hidden? She asked. Helen looked down at the witness stand rail, then up again. Not all of them. Naomi lifted her eyes. Why not? Helen's answer came with the quiet force of a door finally opening. Because someone from the Whitmore family copied part of the archive before it could be contained. The words someone from the Whitmore family did not fall into the courtroom so much as alter its gravity. For the first time all day, every head turned not toward Naomi, not toward the witness, but toward Edward Whitmore himself. He did not move at first. That was what made it visible. Men like him were trained to react to outsiders, to markets, to regulators, to scandal. They were not trained to be betrayed from inside the walls they built. Naomi felt the shift move through the room like cold air finding every seam. Helen Price lowered her eyes after speaking, as if even now she could not quite believe she had carried the sentence all the way into public view. Judge Hayes set her pen down with deliberate care. Counselor, she said, her voice level, you are approaching the edge of surprise testimony. Naomi turned slightly toward the bench. Not surprise, Your Honor. Foundation already laid in sealed proffer and disclosed to defense under protective order. Judge Hayes held her gaze 1 beat longer, then nodded once. Proceed. At the defense table, Mr. Levin leaned sharply toward Whitmore, whispering with none of his morning smoothness left. Whitmore did not answer him. His eyes remained fixed on Helen, and Naomi saw something in them she had not seen before. Not superiority, not irritation. Something closer to disbelief, as if loyalty had been the one asset he had assumed would never fluctuate. Naomi stepped back to the lectern and kept her voice low enough that the whole courtroom had to follow her into the quiet. Miss Price, she said, without naming anyone yet, how do you know a member of the Whitmore family copied part of the archive? Helen took a breath and folded her glasses in both hands. Because I was asked to grant temporary access to a private executive review folder after business hours. Who asked you? The request came through direct family authorization. Was that unusual? Naomi asked. Very, Helen said. Executive review folders were normally restricted to senior counsel and Mr. Whitmore. Did you comply? Helen's mouth tightened. Yes. Why? Helen looked toward the witness rail, not at Naomi, not at Whitmore, just at the wood grain in front of her, as if it were steadier than memory. Because the request was marked urgent and internal. I believed at first it was damage control. Naomi let that phrase sit for a moment. Damage control. The language of powerful rooms. Everything became weather in those places. Nothing was ever called conscience until it was too late. Did you later learn what happened to the copied material? Helen nodded. Yes. Portions of it were preserved outside the company. How? On an encrypted drive. Naomi reached to counsel table and lifted a small evidence pouch sealed with a white label and barcode. She did not hold it up like a trophy. She held it the way people hold things that have outlived the hands meant to bury them. Is this the drive you are referring to? Helen leaned slightly forward. Yes. There was a sharp stillness after that. Not noise. Not drama. Just the unmistakable tightening of attention when something that had been theoretical became physical. The drive was barely larger than a stick of gum. Matte black. Ordinary. It looked like nothing. Naomi had learned years ago that the objects most capable of changing a life rarely announced themselves. A folded note. A missing ledger. A photograph in a shoebox. A drive that could fit in a coat pocket. Your Honor, Naomi said. Plaintiff moves to admit Exhibit 51, previously authenticated through chain of custody and forensic review. Mr. Levin was already standing. Objection as to scope. Overruled, Judge Hayes said. It comes in. The clerk took the pouch. The motion itself was procedural, almost dry, but the room heard what it meant. This was no longer just testimony about what records might have existed. It was evidence that had escaped the system designed to contain it. Naomi looked back at Helen. Did you personally view the contents of that drive? Only enough to identify categories, Helen said. Emails, draft memoranda, archive calendar notes, executive routing instructions. Did those materials include references to my name? Helen answered without hesitation now. Yes. Did they include references to prior contact between me and Mr. Whitmore? Yes. And did they include communications concerning scholarship reductions, donor visibility, and record separation after this lawsuit was filed? Yes. Each answer landed like another stone placed carefully into a foundation that was already too strong to break apart. Naomi turned slightly, enough to let the jury see the sealed pouch in the clerk's hands, enough to let them understand that the story they had heard all day was no longer resting only on memory or motive or the courage of one witness. It had a body now. It had weight. Across the room, Edward Whitmore's face had gone still in a new way, and Naomi understood why. He no longer looked like a man fighting an accusation. He looked like a man trying to calculate what his own house had kept from him. Miss Price, Naomi said, and her voice softened just enough to honor the cost of the question. Why did you decide to come forward? Helen's fingers loosened around her glasses for the first time since taking the stand. When she answered, it was not in the language of corporations or legal departments or executive review. It was in plain human speech. Because I heard how he spoke about you, she said. Not in the hotel 15 years ago. In that meeting. The way a person speaks when he thinks some people still belong outside the room. And I realized if I stayed quiet again, I would be helping him do it one more time. No one moved. Naomi felt something pass through her then. Not relief exactly, because the day was not over and the case was not won. It was something steadier than relief. The feeling of no longer standing alone inside a truth that had once been too large for a child to hold. She nodded to Helen with gratitude, so restrained it almost looked like formality. Then she turned toward the bench. Your Honor, plaintiff calls Mason Whitmore. That was when the sound finally came, not from the witness stand, not from the gallery, but from the defense table itself. Just the faint, involuntary scrape of Edward Whitmore's chair as he turned, too late, toward the side door opening behind him. Mason Whitmore entered without looking toward the gallery, and that alone told Naomi more than his face did at first. People born inside wealth usually learned young how to carry a room before they ever learned how to read one. Mason did neither as he crossed the courtroom. He moved like a man who had slept badly for months, shoulders held square by effort rather than instinct. Navy suit immaculate in the way expensive things often were when the person inside them had no piece left to arrange. He looked enough like his father to make the room notice it immediately. The same height, the same sharp line through the brow, the same pale eyes that could appear cold even when they were not trying to be. But where Edward Whitmore wore control like inheritance, Mason wore restraint like a cost. When he reached the witness stand and raised his right hand for the oath, his voice came out lower than Naomi expected, steady but stripped of performance. He sat, folded his hands once, then unfolded them as if remembering too late that cameras, reporters, jurors, and his father all knew how to read nervousness differently. Edward did not speak. He only watched his son with the kind of stillness that belonged less to affection than to calculation interrupted. Naomi approached slowly, every step measured. She did not need to force drama into the room. The room was already carrying more than enough of its own. Please, state your name for the record. Mason Whitmore. Mr. Whitmore, what is your current relationship to Whitmore Capital? A pause, brief but meaningful. I resigned from the board 11 weeks ago. That moved through the courtroom like a quiet current, subtle but impossible to miss. One of the reporters looked up sharply. Naomi kept her face neutral. Before resigning, did you have access to executive files and internal archive systems? Yes. Including restricted executive review folders? Yes. Naomi let one beat pass. Did you authorize the copy of archived material contained on Plaintiff's Exhibit 51? Mason looked straight ahead for a second before turning his eyes toward her. Yes. Across the room, Mr. Levin was already on his feet, objecting on 3 grounds at once. But Judge Hayes cut through him with the flat authority of someone who had heard enough evasions for one day. The answer stands. Mason did not look at his father. That detail mattered. People expected betrayal to look theatrical. In reality, it often looked like someone refusing to meet the eyes of the person who taught them silence. Naomi moved closer to the lectern. Why did you copy the files? Mason inhaled, and the sound of it seemed loud in the stillness. Because I found out records were being separated after legal hold should have attached. How did you find out? Naomi asked. I saw irregular audit flags during a board materials review. Archive deferred. Executive hold. Non-standard routing. It was not normal. Did you raise concerns internally? Yes. With whom? General counsel first. Then my father. At that, Edward shifted in his chair. Just once. Small. But the jury saw it. Naomi saw it too. What was your father's response? Mason's jaw tightened, not with anger exactly, but with the old strain of someone trying to answer truthfully without reopening a lifetime of unfinished things. He said I was confusing loyalty with weakness. Naomi let that line settle. It told the room more than a speech ever could. Did he instruct you not to pursue the issue further? Yes. What exactly did he say? Mason blinked once, then answered in a voice so even it became heavier for its lack of heat. He said some people mistake access for belonging, and that my job was to protect the family from that mistake. Nobody wrote for a second. The sentence entered the courtroom carrying its own ancestry. Naomi did not need to explain what the jury had already learned to hear. The same belief again, dressed in a different suit. Did you understand that comment to refer to me? Mason finally looked toward his father then, only for a moment, and what passed across his face was not hatred. It was grief sharpened into clarity. Yes, he said, and not only to you. Naomi reached for the sealed drive exhibit and rested her hand beside it on the lectern, grounding the next question in something physical. After that conversation, what did you do? I copied the folders I could access without triggering a deletion cycle, Mason said. Emails, draft memoranda, calendar notes, routing directives, archived comment threads. I stored them off system and later turned them over through counsel. Why? Naomi asked. Mason held the silence for one full breath before answering. Because by then I knew the case was not just about money. His voice changed there, not louder, just truer. It was about who my father believed the law was built to protect and who he believed could be pushed outside the door before the real conversation started. The words landed hard because they were not legal language. They were the plain speech that remained when privilege finally stopped translating itself into policy. Naomi saw something shift in 2 of the jurors at once, the kind of stillness that came when evidence stopped being abstract and became moral. Did you review the contents of the copied archive? She asked. Enough to understand what was there. And what was there? Mason's answer came without ornament. Proof that scholarship reductions were discussed alongside donor optics. Proof that legal response strategy focused on removing you before addressing the merits. Proof that prior contact with you was known internally and treated as a reputational risk. Proof that records were held outside the normal chain after the complaint was filed. He said each sentence as if it had cost him sleep. Maybe it had. Naomi believed that people like Mason were not redeemed by speaking once. But truth spoken at cost still mattered. It changed rooms. It changed outcomes. It changed what power could survive pretending not to know. Mr. Whitmore, she said softly, did you come here today to damage your father? Mason looked down once, then back up. No, his answer was immediate. I came because every person in that building was taught that discretion was a virtue, even when it became a hiding place. And because some silence does not protect a family, it only protects the worst thing inside it. The fluorescent lights hummed overhead. A bailiff shifted near the back wall. Somewhere in the gallery, someone exhaled slowly, like they had been holding breath since morning. Naomi let the silence hold for 1 second more, then asked the final question she had saved for this witness. Did you find any records showing that my name had been identified as connected to the Hallbrook Hotel event before litigation strategy began? Mason did not hesitate. Yes. Naomi lifted her eyes. And where was that record? Mason's voice dropped, but it did not falter. In my father's private archive, under a folder labeled prior exposure. The words prior exposure seemed to drain the courtroom of all decorative sound. What remained was simpler and harder. The faint hum of the lights. The soft turning of a court reporter's machine. The paper-dry stillness of people realizing that the case in front of them was no longer only about hidden files, delayed discovery, or the language of wealthy men in guarded rooms. It was about how long a person could carry contempt forward and still call himself respectable. Naomi did not speak right away. She let Mason Whitmore's final answer rest in the center of the room, because some truths arrived complete and only needed air. Across the courtroom, Edward Whitmore no longer looked like a man managing a bad day. He looked like a man watching the architecture of his own protection fail beam by beam. His attorneys were whispering now with urgent, flattened voices, but even they seemed to understand that the problem was no longer tactical. Tactics belonged to margins, objections, phrasing, sequence. What had emerged here was moral structure, and moral structure was much harder to cross-examine. Naomi stepped toward the witness stand one last time. Mr. Whitmore, she said, meaning Mason, inside that private archive, was there any note or record indicating when my name had first been linked to the Hallbrook event? Mason nodded. Yes. What did it say? He drew a breath and answered carefully, as though each word had already been weighed before he let it into the world. There was a scanned handwritten note attached to an internal profile summary. The note read, and I am quoting, Carter girl from Hallbrook corridor. Watch if resurfaced. No one moved. Even Judge Hayes held still for half a second. And in that half second the whole courtroom seemed to understand that this was not forgetfulness, not imprecise memory, not routine legal aggression. It was preservation. A choice to remember the child he had dismissed, not because she was human to him, but because she remained, in his mind, a future risk to be managed. Naomi felt the old hallway pass through her one final time, not as pain now, but as distance traveled. The navy dress, the missing button, the smell of bleach and hotel coffee, her mother's tired birthday smile, then the long years after, bus rides before sunrise, library lights after midnight, trial notebooks, rent due, doors half opened and then closed again. All of it had led not to revenge, but to this clean, public moment where the truth had finally stopped needing permission. No further questions, Naomi said. Her voice was quiet, but it carried. Mason stepped down from the witness stand without looking toward his father. That, too, felt final. Mr. Levin rose for cross-examination, but whatever sharpness he had tried to preserve through the day had gone dull at the edges. He asked a few necessary questions about access, chain of custody, personal disagreements, timing. Mason answered them without flourish. Helen Price had returned to the gallery, hands folded in her lap, looking emptied out and somehow lighter. When the cross ended, Judge Hayes called a recess before closing arguments. The room broke apart in the restrained way federal courtrooms do, not into chaos, but into clusters of meaning. Reporters stepped into the hallway with their phones already raised. Associates from both legal teams bent over binders they no longer seemed to trust. The jurors filed out in silence. Edward Whitmore remained seated for a second longer than everyone else, staring at nothing Naomi could see. Then he stood. He looked older on his feet than he had on the witness stand. Not weaker, just more visible. Naomi gathered her folders one by one, aligning edges, sliding exhibits into their sleeves, returning every paper to order. She had learned that order was a form of mercy after hard things. Outside the tall courthouse windows, late afternoon light had turned the city pale gold. By the time court resumed, that light had shifted lower, softer, catching dust in the air above the rail like something almost holy. Closing arguments were brief because the evidence had already learned how to speak for itself. Naomi did not perform anger. She did not reach for grandeur. She stood before the jury and named what they had seen, a pattern of exclusion, concealment, manipulation, and selective memory tied not only to money but to a belief about who belonged in rooms where decisions were made. She reminded them that fraud rarely began on spreadsheets. It began wherever human beings were first sorted into who counted and who did not. When she sat down, the courtroom felt quieter than before, as if noise itself had lost confidence. The verdict did not come that day, but the change did. It arrived first in the market before it arrived in the law. By evening, financial reporters were already using words like instability, exposure, board pressure, governance crisis. By the next morning, partner firms had begun creating distance. 2 directors resigned. A major lender announced review. The stock, once carried by reputation as much as revenue, dropped hard in the first hour of trading and kept falling as the day wore on. Whitmore Capital had not collapsed in fire or spectacle. It was collapsing in the way empires often do when truth finally reaches the ledgers. Quietly, publicly, on paper. 3 days later, when the jury returned, the courthouse air felt colder than before. Naomi stood at counsel table with her hands resting lightly on the wood. Edward Whitmore stared ahead as the foreperson read the findings, each one precise, each one leaving less of the old structure standing. Liability, concealment, improper interference, fraud. The words arrived one at a time, but together they sounded like a locked door opening somewhere very far back in time. Afterward, there were cameras on the courthouse steps and microphones angled forward like questions made of metal, but Naomi did not speak to them. She walked down the stone stairs slowly, the late light cool against her face, her briefcase in one hand, the city moving around her as if it had always known this hour would come. Behind her, she heard footsteps she recognized before she turned. Edward Whitmore had come out without the shield of reporters or attorneys close enough to answer for him. For a moment they stood facing each other in the open air, no ballroom, no service corridor, no witness stand, no polished brass reflection to distort what was there. Just a man who had spent years deciding who mattered and a woman who no longer needed him to say otherwise. He opened his mouth as if beginning with apology might still count for something, then seemed to realize how late language had arrived. "What do you want from me?" he asked. The question was smaller than he was used to sounding. Naomi looked at him, really looked, and saw no victory in his face. Only the emptiness left when power had finally stopped mistaking itself for worth. She thought of her mother then, Lorraine Carter, fixing her hair in a restroom mirror with hand lotion on her birthday, because dignity was the one thing poverty had never convinced her to put down. Naomi's answer came calm and clear. "Nothing," she said. "That is the difference between us." Then she turned and kept walking into the last of the afternoon light, while behind her the city carried his name away in headlines and carried hers forward in something far quieter and far harder to erase.